What's up everyone and welcome to Resenha BJJ, and today we're talking about UFC Fight Pass Invitational number 5. And in case you haven't heard, for the month of December, that is until December 31st, you can save 15% at phalanxfc.com with our code Resenha. They've got gis, they've got amazing no-gi gear. As always, make sure you grab some stuff before this deal runs out. Okay, let's start off with the obvious. UFC Fight Pass Invitational is always a phenomenal production. They start on time, matches are one after the other. There aren't these crazy long breaks or commercials between matches. There are some commercials, but they tend to go a lot quicker. It's just a well-produced event that looks very professional, very clean. However, there were a couple issues, or I guess you could say some changes, that made this event stand out. One of the first things you're going to notice about this event is the small mat size on a very high stage, which for Jiu Jitsu just doesn't really work, especially when you have really big athletes like you see in the main card with guys like Dan Manasu and Victor Hugo. You see, what happens when having the match staged in this way is that it negatively affects the performances of the athletes. The referee has to interfere a lot more. He has to constantly push the athletes back to the center. He has to stop the action and reset it in the center. Or even worse, the athletes fall off and in some cases they injure themselves. It's just a really bad idea to have your mats on such a high stage, and it didn't really make sense in this case, particularly because the seating at the UFC Apex is raised. The audience can see the action even if the mats are on the floor. It would kind of make sense, although I don't agree with it, if the seating was all on the floor, then it would kind of make sense to put the athletes on a higher stage, even though really it's not a good idea. So in this case, it really didn't make sense. And we saw in several matches with the referee having to stop the athletes, or in some cases, we had the athletes purposely diving off of the stage. And it just made the matches worse. So if there's one thing that I think can make a critical difference for the next UFC Fight Pass Invitational, it honestly would be, you could keep everything the same, honestly. Just put the mats on the floor, please, and make them a little bit bigger. Okay, the next issue slash change was they changed the rules for this UFC Fight Pass Invitational. The previous event was actually EBI. You had regular time where it's just submissions only, you could pull guard, no points, whatever. And then if the match went to overtime, you started with EBI overtime, so in the back or in an armbar position. However, for this event, UFC decided to change the rules a bit. They made their own rule set that they modeled after ADCC rules. So with this new rule set, you have regular time, which was either 8 minutes or 10 minutes long, and there was no points. So athletes were encouraged to go after submissions. Now, in the case there was no submission, there was overtime, where there were points scored for positions, guard passes, mount, back take, your regular point scoring system. However, there was one catch. You cannot pull guard in regular time without going straight into an established guard or attack. So what this meant is you can pull guard, but you can't just sit your butt to the ground and butt scoot. Pull guard to close guard, pull guard to delahiva. You can do that, but no butt scooting allowed, at least without having established a prior guard. The other way an athlete could score negative points was for passivity, and we saw this a lot. I think just about every match, an athlete scored at least one negative point for passivity. So the referee was constantly saying to athletes, warning, passivity, docking points for passivity, constantly happening throughout every single match. Now, on one hand, you might think, oh, this is great. This is going to be an action-packed rule set. However, Jiu Jitsu doesn't always work like that. You see, in Jiu Jitsu, it can take a lot of energy, a lot of power, and a lot of technique just to stay still. To pin someone in side control can be very, very difficult. And now on the outside, it may not look like a whole lot is happening, but the athlete that is pinning the other athlete in side control is using a tremendous amount of energy, pressure, force, and technique to hold that person there. It's very difficult to hold someone in pins for long times. So when the referee is yelling action, 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 when an athlete is working on wearing down their opponent and just cooking them, it doesn't really serve them to keep moving for the sake of moving or looking like they're doing stuff. So while I totally respect the intentions of this rule set, or I guess of this application of the rule set, I didn't really like seeing how it was enforced. I think athletes should be given the benefit of the doubt in pins, to really wear down their opponent, to really suffocate them under the pressure of a pin. At least with what we saw with this kind of refereeing it was just encouraging movement for movement's sake, which I wasn't really a big fan of. And in result, we ended up seeing a lot of athletes going into overtime with -2 points, -3 points, or -5 points and -4 points in some cases, which you kind of wonder how that affects the athletes going into that. Are they thinking, oh, I've got to submit nonstop, or maybe I should just give up because I've already got a bunch of negatives against me? Hopefully it's the former and they're just wanting to go after the submission and keep competing. But if you do go in overtime and you've got -5 points because you were trying to pin your opponent in regular time, it can be kind of discouraging, make you feel that, the rule set is acting against your style of jiu-jitsu. So an interesting about the timing of this event, it was the same weekend as Nogi Worlds in Vegas. However, it didn't really look like that if you're looking at the audience. You would think that there'd be tons of people who are participating in Nogi Worlds going to see, UFC Fight Pass Invitational 5, to see big names such as Victor Hugo and Nicholas Meregali. But there weren't actually that many people in the crowd, and there were few empty seats. I don't know how well that looked, and really would it have been that hard for them to fill up the seats, considering just the amount of people that were in Vegas that weekend just for jiu-jitsu? Seemed kind of odd. Overall, the production was a 9 out of 10. There's just some minor issues. There were some funny things, like they had a section that was the tail of the tape, which was supposed to, I guess, mimic what you see in UFC, where, they have the measurements of the athletes, how long their arm reach is, what their weight is, that kind of stuff. They had a section for this event called Tail of the Tape, except there was no measurements on it, really. It just talked about like the athlete's name, their nationality, I think their gym, and then it said maybe the weight class, but it didn't actually say what the athlete's weighed in. So you're left kind of wondering, being like, well, where's the tail and where's the tape part of this segment that you're doing? And it seems such an easy thing to get right. They already had all the information. Why not just put on the graphic and give the audience and the commentators a helping hand? Another kind of funny thing that referenced the UFC was when the athletes were coming on stage, the referee would come and check them. So he would brush their arms, check that they got a mouth guard, whatever, check their hands. But he never checked their legs, which was funny because I think all of the athletes wore shorts. But because of the rule change, because of Gordon accusing Nicky Rod of greasing, every single athlete was wearing long sleeves. So funny enough, the referee was checking the athletes' arms for grease, but he wasn't checking their legs. Again, just kind of an odd thing that didn't really make sense. Another kind of theme that we saw in this event was not optimal matchmaking. I would love to know what was the reasoning behind some of the match pairings in this event. Not that the matches were boring or bad quality or anything. It's just when you were watching the event, it seemed like some matches athletes weren't entirely equal either when it came to competition experience or skill. So some of the match pairings just came off a bit as a head scratcher, to me at least. And to illustrate that as an example, we can talk about the first match of the main card, which was Wagner Rocha versus Victor Silverio. Wagner Rocha is an incredibly experienced competitor. He's at the highest levels. He's getting medals at ADCC. He's a very well-known athlete in the jiu-jitsu world. Victor Silverio, again, a great athlete, great competitor. However, when it comes to reputation and that real high-level experience, to me, it just didn't really seem that Victor Silverio was the best pairing for Wagner Rocha. Having said that, Victor started the match really great. He was really pushing the pace, and he seemed to give Wagner a lot to think about. However, Wagner, being Wagner, really just grew into the match as it went on. He started laying on the pressure, hanging his weight onto Victor, and really just tiring out Victor's frames. Ultimately, the match ended in overtime with Wagner taking the back and sinking in a choke. Next up was a really interesting matchup between Elizabeth Clay and Luisa Montera. My predictions going into the match was Luisa Montera really play a cagey game, pressure passing, staying out of the legs, and really just looking to dominate Elizabeth from the top. However, that's totally not what happened. Luisa willingly entered into the legs of Elizabeth Clay, and Elizabeth Clay is notorious for being one of the best leg lockers on the women's circuit. Initially, it looked good. Luisa had a little bit of a bite on the heel from the 50-50, but Elizabeth Clay got out of it, ended up turning the leg entanglement into her favor and locking in a heel hook. I wouldn't say that I'm surprised that Elizabeth Clay won. I think it was a pretty even match that could have gone either way, but I am surprised that she won from a leg entanglement that was initiated from Louisa. Next up was one of the most anticipated matches of the night, at least for me, and that was Jonatas Gracie versus Nikki Ryan. Now, Jonatas is probably most well known for his gi game, but he's actually a really great no-gi grappler and seems to be getting more and more into the no-gi scene. He's explosive, he's got heavy pressure, he passes very well and very quickly. He's got a great no-gi game that poses an interesting challenge to Nikki Ryan, who's kind of more of a more slow, methodical, technical no-gi player, entering the legs, that kind of game. So it was always going to be interesting to see how this match played out. This was a pretty fun match to watch with some interesting exchanges. Ultimately, Jonatas was able to show his dominance over Nikki Ryan, scoring a takedown, putting the pressure onto Nikki, who at one point in the match looked like he fell strangely onto the mats during a takedown and may have injured his knee, which has been a notorious injury for him, and that may have taken him out of the match. The match seemed to go downhill for Nikki after Jonatas scored the first takedown on him, and he really never recovered. The match ended in an interesting scoreline, although probably not interesting for the event itself, with Jonatas winning by -1 points to Nikki Ryan's -2 points. The next matchup was a great fight between Dan Monasu and Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo being Big Man Flow, one of the best jiu-jitsu athletes right now, versus Dan Monasu, a young 22-year-old upcomer of New Wave. And if there was ever a match to tell you why you need to keep mats on the floor and not on raised stages, it would be this one. Come on guys, put the mat on the floor for the next one. Again, this was another interesting match with the referee constantly pushing the pace. Big Dan was losing a lot of points to passivity calls, and the referee was just constantly trying to get these two huge guys to go, go, go. Again, is that really a realistic application of these rules for the ultra heavyweights? To be constantly telling these huge guys to constantly go after action? And it really showed on both athletes. These are guys that train every day in, day out, getting hard rounds. And they were both exhausted by the midpoint of these matches. Ultimately, I think the big deciding factor of this was Victor Hugo's gas tank. He was able to tire less quickly than Big Dan, who at some points just looked like he was lying on Victor Hugo because he had nothing else left in him to give. It was a spirited performance by both athletes despite their exhaustion. Victor Hugo, he kept going, and he persevered. He managed to get the sweep, get mount, and then immediately went for an Americana and submitted Big Dan, who was just tired beyond exhaustion. It's really exciting to see how much Big Dan has improved in a small amount of time and how he can really push the best of the best in Victor Hugo. I think this is going to be a really exciting matchup for years to come, and I could see these two really defining the history of the ultra heavyweights. Next up was Mason Fowler versus Hyson Rita. Hyson came in as a late replacement for Gordon Ryan, who had to step out due to a rib injury. This was an amazing performance by Mason Fowler, who is a veteran of the UFC stage. He managed to take down Rita, pass guard, go into side control, and finish with a Kimura. Super clinical, super clean, great technique, and my submission of the night. And then the co-main event was Nicky Rod versus the ADCC Absolute Champion Yuri Samoas. And boy, did Nicky Rod look good. Nicky Rod really played a classic Nicky Rod game. He went for a great ankle pick, went for a signature body lock passing, got to mount, nearly took the back, tried to choke Yuri, but just couldn't quite get the right angles for it. Still, he just looked largely dominant on Yuri Samoas, who again is the ADCC Absolute Champion who had a crazy performance at ADCC last year. Again, this is another interesting matchup where you have someone like Nicky Rod, who is a fan favorite, is always entertaining to watch. Fans love to watch him, they pay to see him. And then you have Yuri Samoas, who isn't as popular, isn't so much as a fan favorite, but has great experience, being an ADCC IBJJF champion. However, if you were to look at the activity of both athletes, it's pretty clear that Nicky Rod has had a lot more experience, at least in the most recent years, than Yuri Samoas, who has been largely inactive, at least in the last year. Nicky Rod has been on several shows in this year, proving his value to fans and to events on that he is an exciting athlete to be around who wins in great style. And tonight was no exception. And then there was the match that I was the most excited for. Man, how naive was I? Felipe Pena versus Nicholas Meregali. Again, this on paper is a very exciting match. They're A match that has history with Meregali submitting Pena back in the IBJJF, back in the gi a few years back. But then Pena having much more no-gi experience, being an ADCC absolute champion, with Meregali still being great at no-gi, but a relative newcomer to the scene. On paper, this seems like a match made in heaven. However, in reality, it was anything but. The match started off good. There was exchanges back and forth, but then as the match progressed, it just really went downhill from there for Felipe Pena. And again, the stage didn't do any favors to Meregali or Pena. Both of the athletes were having to go back to the center, having to pull shots because they're about to fly off. It, again, was a factor in the performance of both athletes. However, it seemed to be Pena that was affected the most by the mat. In an effort to avoid giving a takedown to Meregali, he actually crawled off the mats and flung himself onto the floor. And then when the referee called him back to reset them in the position that Pena had dove off the stage with, he spent what seemed like at least 5 minutes arguing with the referee, arguing with Meregali, and refusing to just get on with it. And it just did not improve for Pena from there. I don't know what happened with him. I don't know if he was fatigued or if he was frustrated with the refereeing, that he really didn't believe that they needed to be reset in that position. Whatever it was, Pena ultimately broke. And then overtime was a totally different ballgame, with Meregali just dominating. He took Pena's back, trapped him with his arms, and finished him with a one-armed rear naked triangle, just like he predicted a few weeks ago on his Instagram. You really have to give it to Meregali. He has proven himself to be one of the best no-gi and gi athletes in the world right now. And you just wonder, who's next? Who can stop this guy? Who poses even a threat to him? Two names that come to mind would be Craig Jones and Nicky Rod. Craig Jones and Meregali had a very tightly contested match in ADCC last year. However, with the way that Meregali's grown, you have to wonder if Craig Jones still poses a challenge to him. With Nicky Rod, he's also improved at a tremendous pace since the last ADCC. So that would be also a really nice match to really see who is edging each other out for, I guess, the best of the rest title, considering Gordon seems to be the uncontested GOAT of no-gi. As for Pena, you also wonder what's next. This is a guy who was considered one of the biggest rising stars. However, it seems that he's really fallen off that track recently. And Meregali really brings an interesting contrast with Pena. When Pena was younger, he was really pushing himself. He moved to America, he went to Honolulu Bahal's team, he was training with the best guys that Gracie Barra and really the world of Jiu Jitsu had to offer. Now that he's moved back to Brazil and he's training at his own gym with his own students, you kind of wonder if he's really getting challenged and pushed and coached in the way that he needs to keep excelling and pushing himself to the next level. Or even just to maintain his place with the way that no-gi jiu-jitsu is improving at such a rapid rate. And then you look at Meregali, who spent the first part of his career with one team, with one coach, and then left all that behind at the later stage of his career to go to a country, to a new team, a new sport. It kind of seems like they're two athletes going in different directions. And this is an exciting time for Meregali fans to just see that he is topping himself year after year. But for the Pena fans, you kind of wonder, has he peaked? Are his best days behind him? Personally, I would like to think not. However, it seems like Pena is going to have to do something drastic to change his trajectory. Does he even want that? Pena has spoken in the past about pursuing an MMA career. It does seem if there was ever a time for him to just go into MMA, it would be now. I don't know how many people really want to see Pena versus Gordon Ryan anymore. If there was ever a match that Pena needed to win, it was this one. Because right now, he has no momentum going into another Gordon Ryan match. If all it would do, it would just serve Gordon Ryan's grudge against him, and it wouldn't serve the fans, it wouldn't serve the event organizers, at least in my opinion. But what do you think? Is Pena over? Can he still make a comeback? Do you still want to see him versus Gordon Ryan? Tell us what you thought of the event. Is this your new favorite jiu-jitsu event? All right, we'll see you in the next one.